And 2001 is a year full of some of my favorite games ever, man. This is a stacked year in video game history. A lot of people refer to 2001 as the greatest year ever in gaming. And we'll see. Maybe after I finish doing this, I'll do like a ranking list, ranking all the years of, gaming and game releases. But 2001 is fucking stacked, man. It's loaded. So let's go ahead and crack this top 10 open. Coming at number 10, we have Extermination. And this is, in my opinion, one of the more underrated survival horror games ever. It is like this blend of Metal Gear and Resident Evil, where it's not like the totally locked camera that you get with Resident Evil, and it's a little bit quicker than Resident Evil, but it's not quite as quick and action focused as Metal Gear Solid. And I think it really works for the overall feel that they're going for here. With your character being this special agent of sorts, and you're going off and investigating some kind of supernatural occurrence, and you're in this like underground bunker that has a very alien, very mysterious vibe to it. And yeah, I don't know, it's just a really, really unique survival horror game that you can still find for fucking dirt cheap, because it's one that people really don't talk about. It hasn't been blown up with a hidden gem video by one of the big YouTubers or anything like this. This is still one that you can get fairly cheap, and I really, really do recommend it. They have some cool things going on here, like some more platforming elements that you really don't see often at all in survival horror games. Like you can run and roll and jump and climb. Like they got cool mechanics going on here. A really wonky story at times, but one I would definitely recommend if you are a big survival horror fan and you haven't checked it out. It's obviously aged a bit, but it's just a cool one to go back to, and I really do think it's one of the more underrated survival horror games of all time. And then staying right there on the survival horror theme with number 9, I have Silent Hill 2. And this is one of the darkest, one of the most fucked up stories ever in video games in general. And just the leap in technology from the PlayStation 1 with Silent Hill 1 to the PlayStation 2 with Silent Hill 2, I think it really immersed you more into this story, into this narrative, and obviously the introduction of these fucking brutally fucked up characters with Pyramid Head, who has now become maybe the most iconic character in Silent Hill. Definitely the most identifiable character in Silent Hill, but really the story with Angela and the backstory there, that's kind of the selling moment in Silent Hill 2, or at least to me the most memorable moment, the most impactful moment of that entire game was that moment where Angela's pretty much breaking down her past with you. And as dark and fucked up and brutal as this game is, I think it's also incredibly depressing and sad. And then her introduction and her sharing her backstory with you, it really adds to that sense of despair in this world. And it's just a very impactful moment that I think could move even the most calloused of human beings, could move you to tears. So yeah, very impressive in that regard. And also, probably one of the more challenging Silent Hill games of all time. Not with like the boss fights or the difficulty with the enemy encounters, but the puzzle solving is just brutal, man. Brutally difficult. And it's as iconic as any survival horror game ever, which is why it's being remade right now, and I'm really excited to see what they do with that remake. I'm not holding my breath on it, but yeah, definitely an iconic title with a ton of narrative weight behind it. One of the better narratives ever in the genre. Number 8, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3. And the big feature that was introduced here that changed the game for Tony Hawk Pro Skater was the revert mechanic, which pretty much allowed you to string together these incredibly long combo sequences and rack up loads of points as you're going from your half pipe to your revert, and then leading that into a manual, and then combining that with a grind, and then building up that momentum that carries you back to the half pipe. And you're doing this all in one motion while keeping up that frenetic pace. And it was just a game-changing feature. But for me, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, out of the Tony Hawk Pro Skater series, was the one that I have the most personal nostalgia with. We'll talk later, I think 2003, if I'm not mistaken, about another Tony Hawk game that I think is my overall favorite from the entire series. And a lot of the features here in Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 would carry over to that game. We'll just talk about it when we get there. But there's no denying the impact that Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 had with that revert mechanic. It changed the game going forward for Tony Hawk Pro Skater. And I'm just such a huge fan of the franchise. And in that improvement alone earns it a spot on this list. And then heading on into number 7, staying with the extreme sports theme, we have SSX Tricky. EA Big making its first appearance here with, I do believe we have, okay, no, that was, okay, yeah. We have another EA Big game on this list. So, and I'm sure over the years you're going to hear a lot more about EA Big on these lists. But I enjoyed SSX, the first SSX game, and I enjoyed some of the other follow-up SSX games, but Tricky, man. SSX Tricky just totally clicked for me and worked for me in my brain at that time. It was a bit more over the top and arcadey, filling up your meter and pulling off the uber tricks where you have the character doing these like totally unrealistic, silly, almost like dance moves while in air, and then having Run DMC blast and It's Tricky, and you're just absolutely fucking clicked for me. I loved the speed of the game. I loved going through and upgrading your character's stats and like slowly watching them evolve into this juggernaut of a snowboarder that could pull off damn near any move you could imagine on that slope. Just so fun. And I've tried pretty much all of the other games in the series after Tricky, and just none of them quite worked for me the same way that this one did. They all have their charm and fun elements, fun aspects, fun new twists, but It's Tricky, from the vibrant nature of it to the silly characters, like everything about it just worked for me. And yeah, definitely my favorite of the series. Number 6, Devil May Cry 1, the OG, the introduction. It's fucking crazy to think that, in an alternate world where we get RE4 out of Devil May Cry opposed to DMC, since it was initially being created as Resident Evil 4. It's just, I think that this was probably the best case scenario for Capcom. They ended up with 2 huge hits opposed to one very different, very weird, I imagine would have been a very weird entry in the Resident Evil franchise. And yeah, now you have 2 franchises still going strong to this day. And I don't think this is a popular opinion, but I think Devil May Cry 1 is still probably my favorite Devil May Cry game. I know 3 is fantastic, but I was just really hooked on 1 as a kid. And I'm sure, going back to it and playing through 3, I imagine 3 would probably be a much smoother experience than 1. But, being a Resident Evil junkie, it was sick seeing some of the similarities between the 2 games before Devil May Cry went like totally full throttle with the character action elements, which, don't get me wrong, the first game was absolutely a character action game. It literally invented the term, but I don't know, it was just a bit slower, at least in my memory. I remember it being a bit slower than the games that followed it. And I dug that pace, being such a big fan of Resident Evil. And it still had, your high octane badass boss battles and the over the top action, but I really liked being able to slow down and take in the sights from time to time and kind of bask in that gothic horror that Devil May Cry 1 was offering up. It just, I don't know, it felt slightly creepier and just a little bit more my speed than the other games. But I would love to go back and replay through that original trilogy, and obviously I still need to get to 4 and 5. But from my childhood memory, I still would have to say that Devil May Cry 1 would be my favorite. I'm very curious how they have aged, and playing them again for the first time in years as an adult, really curious to see if I would still feel the same way. But no doubt, as important of a game as almost anything else on this list, created an entire genre that followed it. So yeah, we probably don't get the likes of God of War. We probably don't get the likes of Bayonetta and then other titles like that if it wasn't for Devil May Cry 1. So very, very influential, very, very important title, and one that I loved as a kid. In at number 5, I have Max Payne. And then speaking of horror in non-traditional horror games, Max Payne 1 definitely, I would say, qualifies to be in that camp, especially with one section of that game that I still think is one of the scarier moments that I've ever experienced in games, or at least one of the spookiest moments I've ever experienced in games. The section where you follow the blood trail to the sound of your crying child, and then what ends up resulting there, it's easily one of the spookiest fucking moments ever in gaming for me. But obviously, with Max Payne 1, if we're going to talk about any game-changing and revolutionary moments or revolutionary features that came from that game, you got to talk about the bullet time mechanic. One of the most satisfying features, one of the most satisfying feelings ever in a game, where you're jumping in the air, slowing down time, gliding across a fucking bar top and blasting 3 or 4 dudes in the head with just pinpoint accuracy right before that slowdown runs out. It changed the game. It's still a feature that you see implemented into a ton of third-person shooters, and it was so goddamn fun to mess around with in this dark-ass, nihilistic-ass world in 2001. And we're getting it remade at some point. I know Remedy's hands are very, very full at the moment, with Alan Wake 2 releasing this year, Control probably releasing 2025. So you got to imagine, unless they have different teams working on different games, it'll probably be a little bit until we see Max Payne. But I am very much eager for its return. I loved those first 2 titles, and the third one made by Rockstar was incredible as well. And really glad that Rockstar allowed Remedy to go and remake the original Max Payne. So I'm very pumped for that. Number 4, NBA Street. Once again, speaking of EA Big, I talked about this. I pretty much covered everything that I like about NBA Street in my top 10 PS2 games. So I'm going to keep this short, but the pace of NBA Street, it just worked for me. You know, that blend between chaotic, breakneck speed from something like NBA Jam with a touch of simulation from your NBA Live games. It was just absolutely perfect. The balance was so perfect, and it just made for such a comprehensive arcadey basketball game that was close enough to what you could see on the blacktop, but silly enough to make it into an arcadey pick up and play experience that anybody could really jump into. I loved NBA Street, and it's my favorite of the series. I know 2 introduced a lot of features that were game changers, but NBA Street, the first one, still my favorite. Coming in at number 3, I got SmackDown Just Bring It. And this is undeniably one of the more controversial wrestling games of all time. It had many flaws, many issues, especially with the damn promotional material that was pretty much false advertising, showing you character models that in that trailer that look better than most character models in video games today, when the actual game was almost a copy and paste from SmackDown 2, even down to the graphics, which was massively disappointing when you consider the fact that this was, the first new gen WWF game. The season mode, hilariously short, incredibly simplistic, incredibly short. But I will say the one thing about the season mode is that it kind of changed the direction of season modes in wrestling games from that point on, with going with a more narrative focus where you could make decisions that slightly branch off, and you could like roam around backstage and kind of create these quick spontaneous moments that would just pop up, where you could get into a brawl in the fucking boiler room or whatever the case may be, which as a kid to me was so fucking cool. And I would be lying to you if I said I really gave a shit at the time as a kid. As an adult, I would have been pissed about, all the false advertising and all the hoopla about the game looking just like a PS1 game, even though it was on next gen hardware. Like, that would have pissed me off as an adult for sure. But as a kid, I didn't understand any of that stuff. I was just like, holy shit, we got a new SmackDown game on the PS2, and I'm playing the hell out of this thing. I'm playing through every season, or playing through every character in this season mode, and just having an absolute blast with the little 2-hour season mode, and swapping between different characters and getting not all that different of a season mode. But I don't know, it was cool. Like you could pursue different belts and create your own little storylines that way. So I don't know, I'm not sitting here saying it was a revolution in storytelling or a revolution in really any respect. It was very much a copy and paste of SmackDown 2, but I do think that season mode laid the groundwork that was built on with Shut Your Mouth and Here Comes the Pain, and then into the SmackDown versus Raw games. Like, I just personally I appreciate the simulation universe mode style season modes, but I just love having the narrative infused in there with the decision making. And for me at the time, like, getting to make decisions in a wrestling game was just huge. I thought that was so cool. So look, here's the thing. If we're going to be honest, any of my top 10 lists, anytime, probably until 2008, when we run through these, if there's a wrestling game or a WWE game or WWF game that released in those years, if I'm being honest, it's probably going to be on the list. It was just what I played the most of. That and another game that we're going to talk about right here. Grand Theft Auto 3 coming in at number 2. Nothing I played more as a kid than GTA games and wrestling games. And so anytime there's a Grand Theft Auto game or a wrestling game from this time to about 2008 or so, it's going to be on the list. So number 2, Grand Theft Auto 3. And this is maybe the most important game of my lifetime. Not my favorite Grand Theft Auto game. Not really even close. It was just, it laid the groundwork. You know what I mean? It laid the groundwork for what the other games would build off of and iterate and improve from this template that was set with GTA 3. But the boundlessness, the unshackled nature of Grand Theft Auto 3 was something that I never even experienced anything close to that in gaming before GTA 3. And just the speed at which I could get to whatever destination on this map I wanted to get to. And of course, they had like some barriers, some places that you couldn't enter and shit like that. It was early in the process of open world game development. But I just remember like going around and trying to grab the different Banshees in the game. I believe that was the name of the like Corvette looking car, and just driving those motherfuckers at breakneck speed and taking crazy twists and turns, doing insane jumps that I'd never seen done before in games, and building up my wanted levels. And it was just this insane sandbox that I had never experienced anything like that in my life up to that point. And like I said, the next 2 games that followed it, I enjoyed much more than GTA 3, but this is, I don't want to say the most important game ever, but in my lifetime, I would say the most important game ever in my lifetime. So yeah, it was a game changer, and it kind of identified in me what I love the most in games, which, you know, we'll talk about in a second with why I still love open world games. But GTA 3 was an absolute game changer. In at number one, and man, I'm still debating this. Number 1 and 2 are a toss up for me. Right now, I'm going Metal Gear Solid 2 over GTA 3 for number 1. And I think the kid version of me would be quite upset at that choice. I think the kid version of me would definitely go GTA 3 over Metal Gear Solid 2. But, you know, we have hindsight now, and looking back in retrospect, if I was going to go back and play a Grand Theft Auto game from that era, from the PS2 era, from the trilogy, I would play Vice City and San Andreas over 3. If I was going to go back and play any Metal Gear Solid game just in isolation, it would be Metal Gear Solid 2. And so it's tough, because I want to look at these lists as they were at the time and also try to fuse in how I feel about them now. And that's where these two really butt up against one another. And in a different day, in a different mood, I might go GTA 3 over MGS2, but I'm going to go MGS2 at number 1 for now. I think it's one of, if not the best stories ever in games. The prophetic nature of that story and seeing it play out in like modern day society and the political climate is fucking wild. And yeah, just the improvements visually from Metal Gear Solid 1 on the PS1 to 2 on the PS2, and not having some of the more tedious elements, or in my opinion, the tedious kind of simulation elements of MGS3. It was just such a smooth experience that was very similar to Metal Gear Solid 1, but with the improved graphical fidelity and the improvements to the, you know, the quality of life improvements to the combat mechanics and shit. And then just an awesome setting with the tankers, some cool ass boss fights. Like, it is kind of the perfect Metal Gear Solid game for what I want in a Metal Gear Solid game. So I'm going to go with it at number 1. Like I said, on a different day, a different mood, I might swap GTA 3 for that number 1 spot, just because it kind of defined what I love about video games, and that still carries through to this day.